So the human brain is responsible for all of the computation that we do and responsible for intelligence. And it's the best model of intelligence we have so far, unless we count AI. So at the moment this video was made, it's the most intelligent thing we know. How long that will remain the case, I don't know. So the brain, its main computational unit is called the neuron. So the neuron is just a type of animal cell that's been adapted for excitation, so it can perform sort of integration and computation functions. Now the brain is composed, you're probably aware of, like the front bit, the cerebrum, and then there's a little bit at the back of the hindbrain called the cerebellum. Now in total, there's about 86 billion neurons. Now something like a quarter of them are in the cerebrum, and the rest are in the cerebellum. Now there's about the same number of glial cells, which are like maintenance cells, they sort of mop up neurotransmitters and so on. But actually about a quarter of the glial cells are actually myelination, they're oligodendrocytes, so they myelinate axons, they insulate the axons of neurons. Now, in addition to the neurons and the glial cells, you have something like 250 trillion synapses. These are the individual connections between neurons. Now, that's more than 1,000 times there are stars in the Milky Way. So that's an enormous number of synapses. This is an unbelievably complicated machine. So if we look at the cerebrum, this front part of the brain, then we'll see that it's very convoluted. They're called sulci and gyrus. These are like the valleys and the mountains of the brain. And the reason it's so convoluted is because it's trying to pack in an enormous amount of computation, and that's determined by surface area rather than volume. The reason it's surface area is because the computation is packed into a tiny layer that's only 2 or 3 millimeters thick called the neocortex, and that's comprised of 6 layers, and it has a certain structure, and you want to have as much of that as possible. So in order to preserve that, you just increase surface area. So the surface area of the cerebrum is about 50 by 50 centimeters, which is probably the size of something like a large pizza box. So you have this enormous surface area. And if you look at the 2 hemispheres of the brain, you'll see there's a gap in the middle. That's all covered in cortex. Now, all of that is called cortex. So when you hear about visual cortex, somatosensory cortex, auditory cortex, it's all made of the same 6 layers. Although there are differences in morphology, in connectivity, in specialization. Like, for example, in motor cortex is thicker and has more output axons and stuff like that, right? And visual cortex has certain pattern detectors and so on. But the general function or morphology is the same. Like, so the generalized 6 layers is the same. So they're all cortex. Now let me sort of run through what happens. So I'm sort of walking around here in the woods. Now I'm breathing, my blood pressure is being maintained, and that's all happening in the brainstem, in the very base of the brainstem. The mid-brainstem is responsible for how awake I feel. I feel pretty awake today. So I'm receiving loads of sensory input through the eyes, through my ears, through my body, and through the stabilization systems, like the balance system and so on. And apart from smell, all of those, they go through a structure in the brain called the thalamus. Now, thalamus is like the gating of sensory experience. It decides what passes through and what doesn't. Now, that then gets projected onto the various areas of neocortex. So you have the visual information goes through thalamus, goes to the visual cortex. The somatosensory, the sensory stuff, touch and everything, goes to the somatosensory cortex and so on. And then there's obviously inputs from the motor areas too. So all the sensory information goes through the thalamus into the various areas of cortex that are responsible for processing. So whether that's the visual information going to visual cortex, auditory information going to auditory cortex, and these are just different parts of the brain. And then there's not just specific areas like that. There's also things like the prefrontal cortex here, which is responsible for like executive function and like the kind of thinking. But there's no one place that does the thinking. It is truly distributed. So the neocortex has 6 layers. So thalamus projects into layer 4, and then layer 4 sort of decides where the signals go. So they go up to layers 2 and 3, and layers 2 and 3 are like super recurrent. So most of the neurons in there connect to other neurons in layer 2 and 3. but they also connect to other cortical areas, which means they have to go, if I want to go from prefrontal cortex through to visual cortex or some other part of the brain have to go through the middle of the brain. So for that reason, 60% of the volume of the brain is actually connectivity. So the neocortex is called grey matter, whereas the connectivity, or the myelinated axons are called white matter. And they're basically just cables that connect one area of cortex to another area of cortex. And if you think about it, that's why the middle of the brain, apart from the midbrain structures, which we'll talk about in a minute, are white matter, is because if you imagine a brain evolving from having a load of computation just concentrated in the center, once you get specialization and areas grow, they have to sort of spread away from each other, which means that then, but if you want communication between them, you then have to communicate through the middle from one part to the other. So that's called cortico communication. And that happens via layers 2 and 3. Now also, layers 2 and 3 tend to project down into what layer 5 of the neocortex, which everyone's obsessed with for some reason, probably because it can connect directly to spinal cord or motor areas, and it can mediate outputs directly. So then that's what it does. And then layer 6 can project back into thalamus. And then thalamus can project back into cortex. So the thalamus can act as this kind of gating circuit along with cortical areas to control how information is processed. And layer 1 also is like of the neocortex is like a top-down mediator of how information is processed. So that's the neocortex. Now, if I'm trying to do something, like walk up this hill here, my motor cortex needs to send signals out, the correct signals, and everything needs to coordinate, right? I need to see where I'm going, and I need to feed back what I'm going to do, how I'm going to mediate my balance, and so on. And also, prefrontal cortex has to be involved to think, well, are there any sort of things that might get in the way, or that I need to move out of the way? How do I actually plan the route, and so on? So someone needs to plan it, don't just wander about aimlessly. So all these areas communicate via sort of thalamic gating, and then they also use the cerebellum. So this hindbrain structure that's like most of the neurons in the brain is this enormous feed-forward, massively parallel structure that just does prediction. That's its main job. So in the motor cortex, it's like really obvious. It's really easy to explain because what it will do is, if I'm moving my hand from A to B, cerebellum is predicting exactly where my hand's going to be, and if my hand ends up in the wrong place because the visual cortex says it's not actually where you said it was going to be, then that can feed back to the motor cortex. So the cerebellum is this prediction machine. Got a bit out of breath. So there we are. My brainstem's regulating the respiratory system correctly. Let's have a look around. Now I should probably say that motor cortex has lots of layer 5 projections directly through spinal cord to muscles and control systems in the body. Control interfaces, man, like a jet plane. Now, did my prefrontal cortex think that was a good idea? I don't think so. Whoa. So as I'm doing these tasks, walking about and coordinating all of these various areas of cortex, there are other layers being activated. So one of them is the emotional valence. I might be like, this is wonderful, or it might remind me of some memory. We'll talk about memory in a sec. But the emotional valence is mediated by the amygdala. So the amygdala is like not just about fear, it's about all sorts of emotional valence. And that's a midbrain structure. So that's inside your brain in one of the nuclei. And that is essentially overlaying the emotional context onto the processing. But there is no difference between emotion. We tend to think of emotion as being separate from cognition, but these are interlinked in the brain and there's no actual difference. It's just a mediation of cognition by the amygdala. Now, of course, I mentioned memory. Like, I've been in this woods before. I know where I'm going. I'm not lost. So I need to recall the structures about where I've been in this woods. And that's where the hippocampus comes in. Now the hippocampus, it communicates, there's a loop via something called the entorhinal cortex, another part of cortex, where it communicates with the hippocampus. And the hippocampus's job is to retrieve memories or index the right memories for the context. I'm in the woods, like the visual cortex is like, what looks familiar here? Where am I? And so on. Or is there any other memories that I need to retrieve? Like, was there a massive dog in here trying to attack me once or something like that? You know, all of those sorts of things, it's its job to retrieve them. Now, where are the memories stored? Now, this is a crazy bit. They're stored in the same computational structures. So they're stored in the neocortex as well, and in associations between neocortex and midbrain structures. So visual information about this wood will be stored in the same processing units in the visual cortex. Auditory information, maybe I once heard some owls in here, stored in the auditory cortex. And then maybe planning aspects are stored in prefrontal cortex. And of course, this is all like connected massive networks that's mediated via amygdala for this emotional valence and so on. Now, hippocampus is also responsible for storing memories. So if I find a new route or find something new, it'll eventually consolidate that into long-term memory. But its general purpose is like the memory guy. It sort of keeps the context. If you think of like with an LLM, it's like the context window. Now, we talked about cerebellum predicting movement, being involved in this massive prediction. Now, that's not just its job. Only 20% of the projections into cerebellum via the midbrain are from motor cortex. So the rest is from other cortical areas. So what that means is that prediction is involved in all sorts of tasks. So if I'm talking to you and I'm trying to convince you or I'm telling you some bad news, let's say, and I just want to make sure I deliver it in a nice sort of most careful way possible, then I'm going to be looking at your face for micro expressions, for little changes and so on, just to detect, are you actually, I'm not actually hurting you with what I'm saying, I'm being as careful as possible. And that's all involving the cerebellum too, in terms of predicting what's exactly going to happen, in terms of predicting how my speech, make sure my speech isn't slurred or, things like that, or that say the right words. This is kind of controlling the areas that generate speech. So the cerebellum is involved in that too. It's just this general like reality simulator that's engaged in all sorts of feed-forward prediction processes, including abstract thought. So if you imagine that you were trying to, say, abstract rotates and manifolds in your head, in your imagination, or even if you had two abstract concepts that you were trying to marry together. So say you were trying to interpret the woods as like a metaphor for business growth or something, I don't know. To try and marry those two concepts, cerebellum would probably be involved too, even in those bringing together smoothly those abstract concepts. You see what I mean? So we're going beyond just the simple idea of, say, the motor prediction, which is kind of easier to understand, into sort of all sorts of smoothing and operations that the cerebellum can perform. Now, there's one more thing the cerebellum is involved in, which is in timing. So if you, for example, know that something is going to happen in 5 seconds, and you can anticipate that. Now, you don't have to count down to anticipate timing. Your brain can learn certain associations, and it does. Now, the cerebellum only has like a feed-forward pass of like tens of milliseconds, right? It's pretty slow. It's like it can hold a lot of time, but that's not enough for seconds and seconds of computation. But the cerebellum, although it is a feed-forward structure, it has no recurrency in it. It is in a recurrent loop. So it is in a recurrent loop. So it will continue to be updated with new copies of information, including previous state information, so that you then end up you can have context-dependent decay and track time or track evolution of states through space. Now, the cerebellum is actually about almost the same surface area as the cerebrum. It's about 80% of it, which is crazy because it's much, much smaller. There's one final area we should mention. It's the basal ganglia, which is again another midbrain structure. And this is kind of like a reward sequencer, or it's another gating function, like a bit like the thalamus, but for action. So whereas the thalamus gates inputs, the basal ganglia gate action. Now, they also sort of decide what sequences of behaviour are likely to achieve your goal and then select for those. Now, this is all very crude. Now, that probably sounds fairly complicated, the whole overview, but it's actually extremely crude, and it probably will change in the future, because this is all done through like brain imaging studies, through prodding and poking at brains and so on. So, I mean, it's very sophisticated and there's a lot of information there, but there's still so much we don't know about the brain. But I think that's a fair overview from the contemporary sort of evidence that's available to me. And I hope that was a, interesting thing.